guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I'd like to talk today about aerobic exercise and why I feel it should not be incorporated as part of a fat loss program. Before we get to the aerobic exercise, however, it would be a good idea if we had a brief overview of why people are unsuccessful in their fat loss efforts. Generally, when people lose weight, they are not losing just body fat, they are losing body fat and skeletal muscle. This is problematic because skeletal muscle dictates your resting metabolic rate. Generally, the more skeletal muscle you have, the higher your resting metabolic rate. Your resting metabolic rate is defined as the amount of calories that you consume when you do nothing. So lying on a bed, doing no exercise, your resting metabolic rate is really the amount of calories that you would burn, the amount of calories that you would require to maintain your body in that state. The resting metabolic rate, as just said, is determined by your skeletal muscle. So those people with more skeletal muscle have a higher resting metabolic rate, and therefore they require more calories in order to be able to sustain their body weight. Now, what happens when most people lose weight is that they lose body fat and they also lose skeletal muscle. And because they lose skeletal muscle, when they start eating normally again, i.e. the diet stops, what happens is that they regain the weight that they have lost, but that weight is regained as fat. And the reason they regain the weight is because they've lost skeletal muscle, and the previous amount of calories that could sustain them and maintain their body weight is now too great, and so they tend to put weight on. And this is compounded by the fact that many people will go back or may even never have ceased eating a typical Western diet, which contains metabolic poisons, and therefore those people will also have a metabolic dysfunction, which will prevent their energy utilization and their appetite regulation working correctly. So losing skeletal muscle during a fat loss program is detrimental and is the main reason that most people regain body weight as body fat. And what we tend to find is that these people who go through periods of dieting and then eating normally again tend to lose body fat and skeletal muscle during the period of dieting, and then during the period of normal eating they will gain back the weight just as body fat, and so their body composition deteriorates over time. They get fatter, in other words. So what we want to do to be successful when we lose fat is we want to maintain our skeletal muscle. And this brings us to aerobic exercise, because aerobic exercise is a catabolic activity. Now, when you go running, your body requires fuel, and some of that fuel will come from glucose, some of that fuel will come from fatty acids, but some of it will come from protein, and that protein comes from your skeletal muscles. What happens is there are amino acids in your skeletal muscle that are broken down to an amino acid called alanine. That alanine is passed to the liver and it is converted to glucose, and the glucose is burned as energy. So you are using your skeletal muscle as a source of energy when you perform aerobic exercise. So if you are trying to lose body fat, aerobic exercise can be detrimental, particularly if you do too much of it, because it is a catabolic activity. So what should you do instead if you want to maintain your resting metabolic rate and you want to actually perhaps build some skeletal muscle? Well, the answer is obvious. You need to do high intensity exercise such as sprinting and resistance training. Now, it might be worth actually pointing out what I consider aerobic exercise to be. Aerobic exercise, when I'm talking about in discussing it in relation to fat loss, what I'm talking about is jogging for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, long periods of cycling, the type of exercise that is of low intensity, generally of long duration, and is usually performed in the belief that it is burning calories as you do it, and therefore the longer that you do it for, the more calories that you will burn. So if you're jogging for 40 minutes, if you're cycling for 40 minutes, some people do aerobic exercise for longer than that. This is what I consider to be aerobic exercise. High intensity exercise is very short bouts of maximal effort in terms of using your skeletal muscles, weight lifting being a classic example of an aerobic activity. If we actually look at aerobic exercise, running, cycling, all the different types of exercise, they're actually very efficient. They're in a very efficient way of moving you around, and that means that they don't burn many calories. You burn far more calories sleeping at night, for example, than you would if you went for a jog. And this is because your body uses a huge amount of calories to maintain your body weight and your body structure. Protein is a very metabolically active tissue, and because of this, it requires a lot of calories. It does not require a lot of calories to propel you on a jog. So it's a very efficient exercise, and therefore is a very inefficient way of losing body fat. Aerobic exercise is a very good way of maintaining your fitness. I have nothing against people who perform aerobic exercise. If you perform that aerobic exercise, for example, because you're a sports person and you require a high level of fitness, perhaps you do it because you just want to maintain your general fitness level. There are many reasons why you might want to perform aerobic exercise. However, fat loss should not be one of them. Now, the reason that high-intensity exercise such as sprinting and weight training is beneficial to weight loss, well, let's remember we're talking about fat loss here. The reason they're beneficial is because overall they tend to be anabolic. While aerobic activity is a catabolic process, there is a certain amount of catabolic activity when you perform high-intensity exercise, but overall they produce new muscle. They cause protein synthesis to increase, and they increase the size of your muscle mass. And of course, the result of this is that they increase your resting metabolic rate, and this is what you want when you're trying to lose body fat. If you can put on 2 or 3 pounds of muscle, your resting metabolic rate will increase considerably, and the normal amount of calories that you eat will now actually be too few. You can actually eat more if you put weight on a fitted skeletal muscle. Now, there was one caveat to this, and I always need to say this whenever I talk about fat loss, is that you will never be successful long term in your fat loss goals unless you are eating good quality foods. You need to eat a high quality diet, and this is particularly important if you are performing high intensity exercise, because you need to make sure you have adequate protein. Protein is required in a larger amount when you're performing high intensity exercise, because the anabolic processes that cause the growth of the skeletal muscle require dietary proteins in order to be able to happen. Therefore, you need to eat a high quality diet. Obviously, you should be eating lots of fruits and vegetables, but you need to make sure that you're eating adequate protein. So what I would recommend is that those people who are currently trying to lose body fat and are performing aerobic activity, I would suggest that you cut right back on that aerobic activity and maybe stop it completely and switch to high intensity exercise. The best high intensity exercise for losing body fat is weight training. If you can't or don't have access to weight lifting equipment, you can perform body weight exercises such as press-ups or pull-ups. And if you can't perform those because you don't have space or you don't have a pull-up bar, you could perhaps do sprints up a hill. Repetitions of sprints uphill will increase the anabolic protein building effects of your legs and build muscle in your legs. There are many different forms of high-intensity exercise. They tend all to be anabolic, and if you can switch your catabolic aerobic activity for these anabolic activities, you will find that they will greatly improve your fat loss efforts.